Well, welcome to Fixed Income Valuation. Here we'll cover some important yield measures, different yield curves, ways to value bonds, and a couple of yield adjustments, and that'll be plenty. We'll make good progress here. So let's jump on this first slide. I've just got a diagram for you of a simple bond payments through time. This is an 8% annual pay bond per $100 of par value, which is often the way we quote bonds. So 100 means 100% of par value. And we've got 3 coupon payments of 8, and at maturity we also get the principal repayment of 100. So now all we have to do is take the present value of those to value this bond, but we need a discount rate. Well, here we're going to use a discount rate of 12%. That's higher than the coupon rate, so we get a discount bond price here, 90.393 per $100 of face percent. Then we can calculate that present value there as $1,112.03. Now notice we're discounting it at half that yield to maturity. Now if the yield to maturity is the same as our coupon rate, then that bond will be valued at its face value, its par value. And if interest rates go up, that price is going to go down, that present value is going to go down. In this case, at a 12% yield to maturity, the present value of this, its price, would be $901.65. And you can see that convexity again here, because for a 4% decrease in yield, this price goes up by $112.03. Easy to read it right off here. Well, if the yield to maturity goes up, the price is going to fall, but it doesn't fall by $112.03. It falls by less than that. It falls by less than $100. What? $98.35. So this is that convexity. Yield goes up, price went down by less than the price went up when the yields fell. And here's our picture of that convexity, or our representation of that convexity. It's a little bit exaggerated, but that's so you can see it well here. What does convexity mean? It means this price increase when yields go down by 4% is bigger than this price decrease when yields go up by 4%. So as we move down here, you can see the slope is getting flatter and flatter. We can use that as kind of a proxy and say, well, as yields go up, the sensitivity of price to a given change in yield gets smaller and smaller. So for a bond that's at a premium or at a discount, over time, if the yield to maturity on that bond stays the same, its value as time passes is going to move to its par value. And that's what this graph shows here. Now it's shaped like that because that movement toward par value, at least in dollar terms, is getting faster and faster as we move toward maturity. Now this constant yield price trajectory we'll use later when we're talking about selling a bond prior to maturity. If we sell a bond prior to maturity, we might have a capital gain, we might have a capital loss. But let's say I bought this bond at time zero. I bought it for $901.65, and I'm going to sell it 2 years later. Well, let's say I'm going to sell it at this price right here 2 years later. Well, there'll be no capital gain and no capital loss, even though the price is clearly higher than what it was when I bought it. The yield to maturity hasn't changed. So that discount being amortized over time as we move toward maturity. Now, had we sold the bond for this price here, we would have had a capital gain, or a price down here would have had a capital loss. Just wanted to illustrate with this graph something we'll return to later when we're trying to figure out whether we have a capital gain or a capital loss on a bond sold prior to maturity. And it turns out we just keep the yield to maturity the same, change the time, and That's our a little differently. Well, let's define some more yields here. We haven't got quite enough of them yet. Current yield, annual coupon payment over the flat price. For an 8% 3-year semi-annual pay bond priced at 90.165, that current yield is 8. Okay, that's the annual coupon over the price, and that yield 8.873. Yield to maturity 12% here. Remember, that was because of the price 90.165 or vice versa. Okay. So the current yield is lower than the yield to maturity for this discount bond. The yield to maturity takes into account the movement of that bond value over 3 years from 90 up to 100% of par value. So we say current yield ignores movement toward par value. The current yield is going to be less than the yield to maturity for a discount bond, but it's actually going to be higher than the yield to maturity for a premium bond. Now, a yield called the simple yield, and I can only think that this was used like way before calculators and all, but the simple yield assumes straight line amortization of the premium or discount. Okay, so we had the current yield, and we said, well, we didn't like the current yield. It was really simple to calculate, but it just ignored the movement of the bond toward par value between now and maturity. Well, the simple yield kind of has a quick and dirty way of adjusting for that. We're going to take that discount, and if it's a 3-year bond, we're just going to divide that discount by 3 and say, well, what if you got that much extra every year? So that's plus or minus this amortization here. It would be plus the amortization for a discount bond, right? We want to get the coupon rate up closer to the yield to maturity, or minus for a premium bond. So now let's look at the simple yield for our 3-year annual pay bond priced at 90.165. The discount from 100% is 9.835. Divide that by 3, get 3.278. So now that's the annual movement toward par value on this very simplistic method of calculation. So we add that to the annual coupon payments of 8, add that movement toward par value, and we get a simple yield of 12.51%. So now it looks like we've overshot our yield to maturity a little, but we're certainly closer to it. The reason we've overshot is because we use that single price right now in the denominator rather than the average of 90 and face value over the period. But anyway, that's the simple yield. It's in the curriculum. Now you know it. Now you can do it. And for a premium, we're going to take that premium, divide it by the number of periods, and then subtract it from the coupon interest payment to get our better estimate of the yield to maturity. Yield conventions. So far, we've assumed payments are made on their scheduled dates, and that's called the street convention. The true yield actually uses the dates where the payments are going to be made. So they won't be made on weekends, right? Banks aren't open. No payments on Saturday. If a payment's scheduled on a Saturday, it's going to come on Monday. If it's scheduled on a holiday, it's going to come the day after the holiday. I don't think there's any 2-day holidays. Come the day after the holiday. And so the true yield, since the payments are never moved toward you but possibly moved out, that's going to be a little lower than the street convention yield. Now, when we talk about a government equivalent yield for a corporate bond, we're going to restate that corporate bond yield based on a 365-day year. And if we're going to calculate the spread, that is the difference between the yield to maturity on a benchmark government bond and the yield to maturity on a corporate bond, It would be nice if we put the yield calculations for both of them on the same basis. So if we have this government bond yield curve that says, well, a 5-year par bond has this sort of yield, and we want to measure relative to that for a corporate bond, add some yield for a yield spread for lack of liquidity and credit risk, then we want to put them on both on the same basis and use this 365-day year to get a government equivalent yield. Well, we talked about bonds being callable, and if a bond is called, it's not going to have that yield to maturity, or not necessarily going to have that yield to maturity that we calculated. So we need to calculate separately, and this is true for premium bonds. If a bond's at a discount, it gets called early, that just means it moved up to par value or above earlier than it would have, and that's going to be a higher yield. So that's nothing to worry about with a discount bond. But with premium bonds, we want to calculate the yield at each call date and each call price, and then see what's the worst that could happen, and that's called the yield to worst. It's the lowest yield you could get. So we buy the bond, yield to maturity. We know the yield to maturity we're going to make if we hold it to maturity. That's the yield to maturity we purchased it at. So then we look at the call prices and dates. So the yield to first call, we want to say, well, what would be the internal rate of return if the bond were called? So we're going to put in the call price instead of the face value. Might be the same thing, might not. Call price might be higher. And then we set the number of periods to the first call date, put in the first call price, and calculate the yield to call. If there's a second call date or a first par call date, then we'll calculate that. And then the yield to worst is going to be the lowest of the yield to maturity and yield to calls for all the call dates and prices that are on the call schedule. For rates, the credit spread gets wider, higher required rate of return. But it might also be the case that the credit rating stayed the same and the underlying benchmark rates, treasury rates, went up. Treasury rates or swap rates, whatever the benchmark is that we're measuring the spread relative to. So when we talk about a G spread or a government spread, it's the spread to the benchmark government bond yield for the same maturity. So if I've got a 10-year corporate bond, I look at the yield on that, say it's 5%. I look at a 10-year U.S. Treasury bond, and it's 3.5%. Well, that difference between the yield to maturity on the same maturity government bond and the corporate bond, that's our G spread. It's the difference in yield to maturity on those. And we'll use on-the-run bond yields or those interpolated yields for the government bond yield curve. Now, for Eurozone bonds denominated in euros, it doesn't make a lot of sense to give their spreads relative to U.S. Treasury bills denominated in dollars. So yield spreads are going to be relative to swap rates, the fixed rate in a fixed for floating swap. Now, we haven't gotten to derivatives yet, but this idea of a swap rate, just tuck it away from that for now, and we'll get soon enough to what a fixed for floating swap is. But it's a reference rate. For example, a 5-year corporate euro coupon bond might be quoted as mid-swap plus 80 basis points. Well, mid-swap is halfway between the bid and ask yield for the swap. And the 80 basis points, that's the spread. So that spread represents the credit risk difference and maybe liquidity difference between the interbank lending rate, which the swap rate, fixed swap rate is derived from, between the interbank lending rate and the bond. Now, don't get too confused. They could really throw you a curve on this one. because you might have a bond that's a better credit risk than interbank lending. In that case, your spread might be mid-swap minus 10 basis points. So keep that in mind. Don't get tripped up if you get a tricky question like that on the exam. Just go, well, see, that spread's negative to the swap rate. Must be a better credit than the swap. Less credit risk than the loan the swap is quoting the rates for. So these spreads are termed I spreads for interpolated spreads. Out that our OAS, our option adjusted spread, is 120 basis points. Well, I think we mentioned this before, that 120 basis points now shouldn't reflect the option at all. It should just reflect the spread for credit risk and the spread for less liquidity than the Treasury issue, than the benchmark for the spot rates. And so now we can compare the yields on two bonds. Remember, if it was a puttable bond, we'd calculate the value of the put in basis points, add it to the Z-spread for a puttable bond in order to get our OAS for a puttable bond. Okay, well, I'll click once more, but it's not going anywhere. That's our last slide. We seem to have made it through LOS I, the yield spreads. Compare, calculate, and interpret. So that was kind of a long one. Whether you stuck with me or took 2 or 3 breaks during that presentation, either way, I hope you got it. I hope your studying's going well. And I will see you for the next session of fixed income securities when we'll talk about risk, duration, convexity. More good stuff. See you then.